In our reading today, which I've asked you to do silently, Paul appears to talk about the gospel that is veiled to the unbeliever, those who have turned away from the gospel. But he says in verse 3, he hints at where he's going. Even if our gospel is veiled, he says. But in verse 4, he says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers, so they cannot see the light of the gospel. But quickly, we find he is also talking about us. He tells us how to talk about the gospel, how to explain the gospel to the unbelievers for sure, but also to believers, saying in verse 5, for what we preach is not to ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Certainly, Paul is using this image to push us to redouble our efforts to extend the gospel to those folks who don't believe, to remove the veil of the gospel to those who might not have heard the full gospel. But Paul is also telling us that no matter who we preach to, unbelievers or to each other, and here we're not just talking about those of us who preach sermons, but all of us who carry the gospel to each other. Paul is telling us what to say when we talk about the gospel. He says in verse 6 that we are to carry the gospel of Jesus as Lord and not to talk about ourselves. So today, I'd like to focus on us. Those of us who are watching and listening today, for you are here today because you believe in the gospel, or perhaps you're curious enough. You're curious about just what this gospel is all about. I'd like to talk about Paul's encouragement, actually his insistence on the gospel as it applies to us today, so that we can have a fresh start on Lent, which begins on Wednesday. Certainly, we have had a veil of darkness pulled over our eyes for the past year. It's been almost exactly a year since we stopped gathering together in worship. Gathering together to have our fellowship meal, to laugh, and share our joys together on Sunday morning. And perhaps some of you have wondered, where has God been all this year long? Hidden in a veil of darkness for a year has led to fear and confusion. Back in the spring, we thought, well, what is this virus that has overtaken us? Will I get it? Will I get sick? Do I dare leave the house? How can I get my groceries? When do I go to the grocery store? Remember those questions? And when will we ever get back together? Maybe in May, maybe in June, August, for Christmas. In all this, there was confusion and fear. And where is God in all this? And then in the spring, we were swamped with reports of police killings of young black men. And there were marches, even riots, protests, and protests against the protests. There were attacks on people in Chinatown. And then a new movement, Black Lives Matter, grew up. And what do we make of that? How does it affect me? How does it affect you? It seemed to be aimed at white privilege. But how does it affect everyone? Even more confusion, even fear. And perhaps we asked, what is God in all of this? Where is he? And as we entered the fall, there was the election. What would happen? Would the election even happen? Would the election collapse? Would it be a fair election? With the actual election came protests, even violence. more confusion, and a lot of fear. And finally, there was the insurrection of January 6th. We have been in the veil of darkness, of confusion and fear for a year. Perhaps for some of us, this has been the darkest year of our lives. And we wonder, where has God been? Of course, we could blithely say, well, God has a plan. But this is a statement said out of nervousness. We sure hope he has a plan. And so, after a year, where are we? Well, the vaccine is out. And a number of you have already gotten your first shot. Others have appointments for a shot. There's hope that many of you will be vaccinated by summer, the rest of you by the end of the summer. And medical science has grown as they've been working on combating the virus. The Black Lives Matter movement didn't just explode and then die away as many expected. It led to a new movement to explore racism, structural racism that affects all people of color. Our presbytery has embraced this movement. I joined a small study group to explore our own part of structural racism. A small, intimate study of about 20 people, which ballooned to almost 140 people. And some of you are involved in programs such as the one spearheaded by Noe Valley Ministry. What began as an isolated movement has become something that is helping change society. And the election, well, there was an election. Votes were cast, votes were counted. And we have a president. And the nation didn't collapse. In fact, it was strengthened. It's too early to see what the outcome of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol will be. We'll see. Today, after a year under the veil of darkness, under the veil of fear and confusion that has covered us, this veil of darkness has been lifted, and the light of the gospel is showing bright. But are we to be surprised? We have only to look at the gospel itself for the answer. Jesus didn't promise an afterlife full of angels playing harps if we believed in him. He didn't promise a heaven that awaits us. Jesus didn't promise an easy, stress-free life. No, Jesus promised us that following him, we would no longer have to be in the grip of fear. As he told the disciples in the midst of the storm on the Sea of Galilee and repeated throughout his ministry, we no longer have to fear fear itself. And reading the Gospels, John says about Jesus, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. This light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And Jesus said of himself, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. The veil of darkness has been lifted from us, so follow Jesus as we step into the new year. With the Easter on the horizon, we know that God is with us. Jesus is by our side, and the light of the gospel shines ahead of us. Amen.